It has been said that average people want you to stay average. Welcome to the Breaking Average podcast, the podcast designed to challenge you to break the mold that average has on the world. Each episode offers insights directly from those who choose to break average every day. Now, for the latest insights, here are your hosts, Paul Gustafson and Rick Morris.
Welcome to another episode of the Breaking Average podcast. I'm your host, Rick Morris, and my co-host is here, Paul Gustafson. How you doing, Paul?
Rick, great to be with you, man. I'm excited. We get to go into book 2, and it's one of my favorite all-time books. I can't wait. So we had so much fun on the last one, and here we are doing another.
Yeah, and I don't know if we really said it in the last one, but this is book 2 of our 16-book mastermind series, and we did a draft of 16 leadership books that have stood the test of time. And really, so some of our criteria was they had to be out there for a while. They have to still be relevant. And something that we would still recommend to people to read today. So it's not necessarily an all-time greatest list, but it is. We did throw some criteria there to make sure that we were selecting these books.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I think it's going to be, we really want to hear from our viewers and listeners, right? We want to hear your thoughts and takeaways from these books that we picked, but also let us know other books, because we know Rick and I, we have a long list of books here, and we could have pulled out another 16 and they would be amazing. But these books really spoke to us from a standpoint of two things. One, present day, like they have value today, but also they've had value to us in the past. So when a book kind of reaches back and had an impact for us in the past, but it also has an impact for us in the present, then it's a book that we also want to read in the future. And that's what we're trying to pick. So I'm excited to do this. And boundaries for leaders. Have you read this before to this go around?
I did it for today. And what was really interesting of what you just said, if you didn't hear the first podcast, go back and listen, because we shared with how Paul and I process books. But I love you throwing it to the audience, because we could end up offering a service here of, they could pick 5 or 6 books that they haven't had time to get to and read or that kind of stuff. They want a 45-minute synopsis, then you could suggest them to me and Paul, and we'll knock them down, because we love new material, and give you a synopsis right here on the podcast. That may be a service we do, Paul.
Could be. It certainly should make a very interesting and compelling podcast, and we really want to provide value to you guys. It's so important that we hear from you, and we just appreciate all the comments we've received so far. Continue to tell other people about our podcast. Go to breakingaverage.com and just let folks know. So yeah, here we are, man. Boundaries for Leaders, Dr. Henry Cloud.
So we said that these books had to have an impact on us, something that we've read before, but that doesn't necessarily mean I've read it or you've read these books, because we had a selection. So Boundaries for Leaders was a new one for me, but it was a book that you put onto our list. So lead us into it, Paul. Why is this book so important?
Yeah. I skipped out on the initial Boundaries. I guess that was a breakthrough book by Henry Cloud. And
now that one I've read. Yeah, I read that one.
I've since then read it, but this is the first Boundaries book that I read. And when I read it, and here's what's interesting. I'm in a different space and a place than I was when I first read this book. So when I read it 8 years ago, whenever it first came out, and I brought a group through it, and I know a few of you guys who are watchers or listeners to the podcast were part of that platform builders mastermind that we did on Henry Cloud. We had Henry Cloud on a call. Nice. I've had him on a call 3 times now, I think. We went through this book, and it really kind of clarified how I think for us then, for those that mastermind it clarified how we need to position ourselves in our business, in our space, so that we can actually be focused on what we're working on and make that impact without being overwhelmed. And we live in a state of overwhelm even today, right? So how do you live and work and lead in a way that allows you to be able to really not just manage, but lead other people effectively and lead yourself effectively? And this book, there's a lot of great books, so I'm not going to say there's not another book like this. There are other books, but not like this. This book right here really, Here's why I think it's even better than I thought. He talks about how the brain works. And as you and I have gotten to know Dr. Dr. Amen, right? Different author altogether, it aligns so nicely. I was telling my wife, who's a brain health coach, I said, Barb, you got to go back and read Boundaries for Leaders. It's like brain health stuff right in this book. It's perfect. So, and I can't wait to unpack more of it today. So that's, there's several reasons why, but I highly recommend this book. And if you're trying to, if you're a coach and you're trying to guide somebody and help them in their leadership capacity, be a better leader, and get some clarity in what they're doing, this is a great resource. This is a book I would highly recommend that as a coach, you mastermind with your clients.
Yeah, so let's break it down a little bit, right? So first of all, there's 7 leadership boundaries that he really goes through in this book. And this is what makes everything work, how they set the stage, the tone, and the climate for people's brains to perform, like you were talking about. So in the book, you'll learn how to set boundaries to help people's brains work better.
Yep.
How to build the emotional climate that fuels performance.
That's right.
How to facilitate connections that boost people's functioning.
Mm-hmm.
Facilitate thinking patterns that drive results. Focus on what behaviors shape results. Build high performance teams that achieve desired results, and then help you lead yourself in a manner that drives and protects the vision. Those are essentially the boundaries that are covered.
Yeah, and I love that statement that he makes after he shares those 7. He says, as a leader, you always get what you create and what you allow. And that's really
huge.
That sets the table for this thing, right? So what do we mean by boundaries? And he unpacks it, but he makes that point. You always get what you create and what you allow. So
that quote was big, and we'll come back to that because it's a little bit further down, because we start talking about corporate culture and company culture and those kinds of things. That was really cool to me. A quote that jumped off right out of the page at me being a project manager and plans and that kind of stuff. And he's talking with that CEO, where he says, everybody out there is always trying to figure out the right plan. They meet, they argue, they worry, they put all their energy in trying to come up with the right plan. But the truth is that there are 5 right plans, and there's a lot of ways to get there. The real problem is getting the people to do what it takes to make the plan work. Yeah. And that was just like,
the people are the plan, right?
Yeah.
That's what he says.
Yeah.
The people are the plan.
The people are the plan. Yeah. That was so cool. Well said.
Yep. Drop the mic.
Yeah. Yeah.
So Dr. Cloud, if you're listening or watching the Breaking Average podcast, we know you have boundaries, but you're always invited into our neighborhood. Come over. We want to chat with you, because we would love to have a conversation on this. And you wrote this book 10 plus years ago, I think it was, but I'd love to get your take on this, because you hit it right out of the park. Yeah, so I'm pulling off my notes here, and let me just share a little bit as we're doing this. We also want to share you our tidbits and approaches to doing books, and we unpacked a little bit last time. I'm going to share something new, Rick. When I open up a Kindle and I start to really mark it up, and I love highlights, right? In Kindle, you get 4 colors, guys. You get yellow, pink, orange, and blue. I like to mark up my books using those four color pens, right? And the way I do it now, and I'm looking at my notes from way back when, and I noticed that I hadn't figured out my style yet. So it's kind of interesting seeing how I've transformed. But my style today here's how it works. If it's a key point, if it's like a real nugget, if it's key and core, yellow. I'll use the yellow highlighter. If it's something that's an observation, like there's some scientific research, there's something very observable, I use orange for observation, right? So I'll use that orange highlighter. And then if it's something that's like, ooh, that's an action step, that's something I need to do, that's something I need to apply to my life and have some intentionality in doing what it says, that's blue for action. And then if it's a question, or if there's a question in a statement, and usually I put that in a note, you can use notes within Kindle, which is really cool. I use pink or red, kind of, it's like marks it. It's a pink. So that's what I do. And I see I did a little bit of that in here, but again, I read this book such a long time ago, and it was fun kind of going back through it this week and just exploring it. And I'm cleaning up some of my highlights, but that's my highlight style. I don't know. Do you do any kind of highlighting in your books?
I don't, because then I get confused as to what the colors are. It's so that's just me. Like as detailed as I can be.
Yeah.
If I start going through colors, I'll mix them up, and then I do underline and bold and do a highlight, but I don't do different colors.
But now I gave you a new game plan. I gave you some boundaries for highlighting your book.
Yes. I love though sharing those types of things and hearing how people process, because not only do you get ideas yourself, but it's just cool to see people's process and what they really do. For me, I have to write the quote. So if there's something that I really like, I have a book of like quotes and ideas and that kind of stuff, and I actually will touch it twice. So if I see something in a book, I'll write it into another book. So I'm actually physically writing, which is how I remember things.
Yep.
And then I'll go back and type that quote into, I have a journal that I tag. So when I'm trying to write content or that kind of stuff, I can go through tags and pull things out that I want to reference. So I actually will touch something twice is how I kind of commit it to memory. That's my trick.
That's cool. So one of the things I highlighted, Rick, in this book, and I put it as an orange, as an observation. It's certainly an observation, but it's also a key point. So I could have made this yellow. Is he says that when leaders lead in ways that people's brains can follow, good results follow as well. And so, guys, if you're into brain health, this is a book that you want to leverage and use. If you're curious about brain health, there's certainly other resources we can highlight that. But if you want to look at it from the executive level, right, the executive part of the brain and how we lead others, man, this is so powerful. I love how he clarifies that. So that was a really key point for me. But then chapter 2,
love the title.
Yeah,
love the title.
Ridiculously in charge. He makes his point. You, as a leader, are ridiculously in charge. Yeah. So tell me why you love that point.
Well, first of all, it's just a great choice of words, ridiculously in charge. Because a lot of times, as a leader, you're told to kind of mute the fact that you're in command or in charge. You want to be empathetic and that kind of stuff. But that doesn't mean that your mindset can't be that I'm ridiculously in charge of everything. And why this chapter, I spent more time in this chapter than anything else, just because there were so many parallels to my consulting career.
Yeah.
But I can tell you how many times I was hired to change something that never changed. And I know, like when I speak from stage, people will come up to me afterwards and go, wow, what you said was really cool, but that'll never work in my company. That'll never work here. My leaders will never listen to that. And people just begin to discount right away. And one of the things I talk about when I talk on stage is changing culture from within when you have no power. And right, you do that through modeling the behavior. And I had specific examples of my career where we actually changed a company with a rule by fear CIO to really embrace this new methodology that he said he would never embrace and that he hated. But we did that through positive reinforcement and modeling the behavior. And when I speak about that, they go, oh, that sounds great, but it'll never happen here. And it's, again, who's in charge of the culture? I met so many leaders that go, yeah, but my people just won't do this, or my people just won't go for that. Perfect example. I used to do implementations of project portfolio management systems. And one of the things to get the metrics that you want out of that is to record time in multiple ways. You can do it different ways, but the resource manager, where this always fell, it was so funny. They wanted to know cost of development, cost of things, that kind of stuff, right? So we got to get their people doing timesheets. But one of the most effective ways, not doing timesheets, Paul, is to get the resource managers just to sit down and put a percentage of time that their people are spending against each initiative. Should take no more than 5 or 10 minutes a week. Super easy, like an Excel spreadsheet. And they go, yeah, our resource managers just won't do that. I was like, sure they will if you make it a condition of their employment, right? Like if you say this has got to be done and you follow up, you'll get it and you'll get these results. And I have a story of Asurion, which is a huge company. I could tell you plus or minus 1% of their GL to their spend because their CIO took it seriously, mandated it, followed up with people who didn't do it. And there's people who go, I want that result, but they won't put that level of effort into it. And I'm like, but it's your effort. Like, if you want this report, you're the leader, you can make it happen. You can just create an environment where everybody understands how important it is. Yeah, but
Yeah.
my people won't do that. Like, it's so frustrating to watch.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on this. You know, Cloud makes this great point. He says, hey guys, in the end, as a leader, you're always going to get a combination of two things: what you create and what you allow.
I almost wanted to save that at the end, but that, if you get nothing else from that book, nothing else, that quote right there is so money.
That's what boundaries are, guys, right? So he says that's the two things. Our boundaries are what you create and what you allow. And that, to me, I remember way back when I first read it, and still today, like, and what you just shared, it's like, it's so critical. I have to ask myself, we're going to give ourselves a tip and challenge right here, guys. I have to ask myself, what am I creating and what am I allowing? Right? I have to ask that question. If I don't, then I've totally missed the point of this whole book. And you, as a listener or a viewer, have to ask that question too. So, early tip. That's our early tip and challenge here. I'm sure we'll have more.
It was my tip and challenge, but I'm going to reinforce it anyway, because
That's right.
I've got an activity around that I ended up doing on a personal level. Once that quote, really, I mean, we could spend the next 30 minutes just discussing the intricacy of that quote. And one of the things of why I followed Maxwell for all the years that I did was his ability to take really, really complex things and boil it down to 6 or 7 words that you could remember, that could trigger action. And to me, that line right there is the entire book.
Yes.
And it's something that now that's in my memory. I'll never, every time I'm sitting there going, God, I'm frustrated by this, or I'm upset with this, the first question you ask now is, did I allow that to happen?
Yep.
Where in my actions and activities did I allow that behavior to exist?
Yep.
That right there is that's a pause moment for me.
What you create and what you allow. So powerful. Oh, wow. He says, you know, leaders are a positive force for good and a negative force against bad. And, you know, he says, you know what they're for and what they're against. What are you for and what are you against? Another power question, right?
Yeah.
So,
you know, going on even in chapter 4, I really like that he spent some time around the emotional side of it, emotional climate. One of my great friends, Colin Ellis, says it very well, to credit him. But the soft skills are the hardest. And the soft skills aren't what we train, but the soft skills is what can make or break an organization. And you know, all this stuff started coming around emotional intelligence and, you know, EQ and all this other stuff that popped out. But at the end of the day, managing an emotional climate, as he said it, right? Chapter 4, emotional climate that makes brains perform, right? That's really, that made me take another glance at it as well, just the chapter heading, because it's not really emotional state, it's an emotional climate, right? It's a consistent climate. It's you go to the south because it's warm, you go to the north because it's colder, right? It's a climate, it's consistent. And I really, really like that.
And that's such a powerful chapter too. And I love how he builds off something he said earlier, right? So in chapter 2, he says the work of leaders is twofold: to make sure positive conditions exist and to rid organizations of the negative elements that stand in the way of high performance, right? So that's what we're talking about here when we're talking about an emotional climate. And he makes this statement that I put in it as a question. He says, just think of what is possible in the right condition, if the right conditions exist, the right emotional climate exists. And then he gives a litany of different things. I started to write them down too. Like, okay, if the right conditions exist, if we have the right emotional climate, what do we get? And he says things like innovation, creativity, problem solving, goal orientation, planning and organizing, initiation and perseverance, adaptation, self-regulation, and more. And I'm like, Rick, high performance, right? Who do you know that talks about high performance?
Yeah, right, right. I think the part that really spoke to me in this chapter is when we start talking about the two types of fears. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think it's very relevant with what's happening, politically and emotionally within this country. And I started to look at some different things. But what he says is that there's two types of fears. He says, by destructive fear, I mean the kind of fear where people are afraid of a person instead of concerned with the issues. The right kind of fear, or better yet, positive stress, is when we're concerned about some potential reality and the consequences of that reality, instead of fearing someone's anger or shame or a relational consequence for some sort of mistake. And if you look through our history at the times where the country really came together, where we are all in the same emotional climate, you look at the moon landing, you look at 9/11, you look at some of these things where the country really seemed to come together, and then you
Yes.
look at the divisive side, right? And the current emotional state of the country, regardless of what side you're on, it's stressful, right? It's very divisive right now. The country's not very well together, and we're fearing what other people say or do versus what that consequence or potential good consequence could be coming from us coming together. It really spoke to me at this time.
Yeah, that whole piece there on avoiding the negative, accentuating the positive, the bit on toxic emotions, really powerful. He makes this other statement that just kind of dropped the mic for me. He says, people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses.
Yeah.
I'm like, I had to go back. I'm like, wow. No, Henry, Dr. Cloud, no, COVID. It's created confusion. It's yeah, people leave because they're distracted. But I'm going back to this. He says people don't leave jobs, they leave bosses. And I realize how critical that is. What a great point that is for all of us. It's another challenge. All right.
Well, yeah, and he also talks about gaining insight into change. He says the act of paying attention to what I need to do differently and better next time can't happen if I'm afraid of what you might do to me now.
Yep. So that was from chapter 4, right?
That's all chapter 4.
Yeah. Chapter 4 is oh man, I got so many highlights. I think there's more highlights of that chapter that I have than non-highlights.
Yeah, it's a pretty powerful chapter. In chapter 5, he starts talking about the power of connection. And again, if you follow our challenge from the last podcast and rereading a book or reading a book for me for the first time, but in the current state, right? Um, we've got an event that's coming up in August that I look forward to. It's twice a year, but the most powerful thing here, I always said that that's where I fill my cup. That's where I pull energy from other people. It's that power of connection. It's like-minded people that are positive, that are driven. They're all goal oriented. They've all been called to a greater purpose. And when you're in a room full of people like that, that power of connection really can fill that cup. And
yeah.
it just made me reflect on that.
Yeah, I love that. And it, again, building off what he shared, because he talks about empathy and 4 as sort of a practical approach, but that connection bit that you're talking about, how, the whole relationships reduces stress. Love that bit. And leaders foster connection and unity, to what you're saying.
Yeah, I've always had to have a boss that I could trust. Like I have to genuinely like my boss in order for me to be effective. And I know that's weird because it really doesn't have anything to do with the company or whatever, but like I have to genuinely have a connection with my boss in order for me to be as high performing as I can be for that organization.
Well, let's talk about, Henry Cloud talks about the ingredients for connection and unity, right? So, and this would be that right kind of boss thing. So he talks about 4 things, I think: shared purpose, awareness, right? So as a leader, you need to have awareness, guys. You need to be aware of what's happening. He talks about these nonverbal cues, right? Have you ever had that boss that gave you some negative nonverbal cues? The gestures. How impactful is that? All right. We either can lead by our nonverbals, lead in a positive direction, or we lead in a negative direction with our nonverbals. How are you leading in your nonverbals? It's a good question. And then the last bit is collaboration, right? Centers on collaboration. Actually, he's got more stuff.
He's got a lot more. I was going to say, I was going to let you go with that, but he's got conflict resolution. emotional regulation, emotional reflection, and emotional repair. I really like those.
Oh yeah, those are good. Yep.
So regulation, reflection, and repair.
And then the listening bit.
Yeah.
So much. Okay. He says, right after that, united we stand. Key quote, imagine an organization, and this is kind of a really good setup here. Imagine an organization where everyone feels a strong sense of shared purpose, where people relate to one another in a way that fosters greater awareness of the work and of themselves because they feel deeply understood in a shared common purpose. And he goes on. Then he says that kind of culture is not an unrealistic ideal. And I love that. I love that take. You know, it casts a vision for us as leaders and the businesses that we're supporting, organizations that we're leading. We can create that. We can create that environment. You know, and somewhere it was my favorite line about having that working memory. I'll find that here in a second. But thoughts on that?
No real thought. I mean, I think it's beautiful, right? I mean, I think it's well said, but no real additional thoughts there.
I love the questions that he has at the end of the chapter, though. Did you see some of those questions?
Yep.
So at the end of each chapter, guys, like one of them is, what barriers stand in the way of deeper connectedness right now? What are those barriers? What is the biggest thing that you need to do differently as a leader to increase connection? Power questions. Take time to kind of reflect on those. Those are good.
Yeah, some follow-up questions that were kind of created too is like, during meetings, do you say I hear you when you aren't really listening? Or do you say I'll get back to you on that issue, but you really don't have a pathway or a commitment to do so, right? Like, are you really getting back to them on that issue? Things like that really can kind of make sure that not only you're setting proper boundaries, but you're following through.
Yeah. Well, there's so many good, powerful things in here. We've only gone about halfway in, but he does kind of hit on the last chapter. First of all, he talks about high performance teams, which I think that would be a sweet spot for you in chapter 8. He talks about trust makes teams able to perform, which is important. Then he talks about boundaries for yourself. So he ensures that. I love how he comes back, right? So we're trying to lead others, but we've got to have boundaries for ourselves. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, in high performance teams, the aha moment here is he says everything that causes bad outcomes is in your control to change, and everything that causes good outcomes is also due to your behavior. Change behavior and you change outcomes. That is power and empowerment.
All right. Well, let's should we close it up? Man, there's so many good nuggets.
There's one more. Just the last thing is that trust makes teams able to perform. And so if you really ever think about anything that's really gone wrong in an organization, look at it through that lens. Somewhere, some way, somebody broke your trust. And that's essentially when the relationship started to fall apart. So trust is really, really important in keeping an organization together.
Absolutely. So critical. And I want to plug, we didn't pick his book for this go round, but The Trusted Leader, David Horsager, great new book that came out recently, built on his original work called The Trust Edge. But that trust is such a critical component to it. So I'm glad you brought that up. So let's land the plane here, Rick. Man, what are your thoughts, tips, and challenge on this one?
Yeah, so I'm going to come back, even though we discussed it earlier, but it was that statement of what you create and what you allow. My challenge to that is to take a personal inventory. Sit down right now. What are the 4 things on your mind or 5 things on your mind that are really frustrating you? Your current situation, things. It could be something that's coming up in the next 2 weeks. It could be an overall relationship. It can be just things that are just really frustrating you. And the questions that you ask is, did I create that or did I allow that? And really think about what that potential is. And I think you'll find some interesting answers.
I love that. Love that. Rick, my tip and challenge is really coming right out of this book. You know, Henry Cloud really makes this emphasis. And I remember from way back when, and I had this conversation with him about the importance of these 3 things: attending to what matters, making sure you're clear on what those things are, inhibiting what doesn't. So like, well, that doesn't really matter. Then why are you spending time on that, right? This is for yourself personally, but also with your team. Make sure that you identify what matters, attend to what matters, inhibit what doesn't, and then maintain a working memory of the things and the reason, the vision that you have. Make sure you have that, because that'll allow you to continue on with attending to what matters and inhibiting what doesn't. You got to do it as a team. You got to do it for yourself, yes, but also it's an opportunity for you as a team. And these are questions. These are the questions that we can have. Like, you can do a stand-up. Like, think about this, right? Rick, you guys do agile kind of stuff, don't you?
Oh yeah, stand-ups every day.
So at stand-up, one of the questions we ask is, what are you working on? What's inhibiting you, keeping you from doing what you need to do? Well, one of the greatest inhibitors of all time are the things that you're doing that aren't really of the focus that need to be done, right? So we may have inhibitors that are real technical issues and struggles and challenges, yes, but if it doesn't matter, right? If we're spending time on that, that's going to get us out of play, because remember, you are ridiculously in charge. That's the whole idea. And so that's my challenge, guys, to you, is just remember, you are ridiculously in charge. Attend to what matters, inhibit what doesn't, and maintain that working memory of what's key. So, thoughts on that?
Yeah, if you don't like what's happening, don't allow it. That's really at the end of the day. So well said. But I've really appreciated you bringing this book to my attention, Paul, and having us go through this.
Yep, very cool, guys. Well, thanks for joining us on this podcast. I'm just pumped. We got some great books. We want to hear from you, and we're going to take, I guess, Rick, are we going to take these 16 and kind of give a top 4 at the end of the?
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan.
That'd be kind of fun, right? So somehow we're going to magically go from 16 down to 4. You guys have heard 2 so far. Last week we talked about First Break All the Rules, Marcus Buckingham and the folks at Gallup, right?
Yeah, Gallup organization.
And this one's Dr. Henry Cloud, Boundaries for Leaders. So you guys will want to tune in for next week. We got another great book. Can't wait. Rick, thanks, man.
Thank you, partner. And join us next week as we dive into another book. We'll talk to everybody soon.
All right, thanks.
Thank you for listening to the Breaking Average podcast. If you loved what you heard, please take a moment to subscribe. All opinions and comments expressed in this podcast are those of the participants and do not reflect the opinions or views of any of the advertisers, producers, or platforms. This show was produced by R2 Multimedia. A special thank you to Milestone Melodies for our theme music. As you continue your day, what is one action that you can apply from this podcast to your life? Tune in for our next episode as we continue to challenge everyone to break average.